So we are recording. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to I believe this is the 8th session of the Strategic Leader and Accessibility Community of Practice discussion. This session will focus on strategic accessibility planning and implementation of a strategic plan. I'm going to get us started with just a brief introduction and an overview of our agenda. So we'll just take a few minutes just to recap what the task force has been up to lately. And today's agenda, as I said, we're looking at designing and implementing a strategic accessibility plan. This involves setting up standards and governance, creating multidisciplinary accessibility groups, creating the plan itself. David is going to explain to us what he means by eating the elephant and how to prioritize your plan. Jay is going to give us a case study on Minnesota State and also touch on COVID and the impact of adapting quickly in crisis. That should take about half of our time this morning, and then we will open the floor and allow everyone to provide their thoughts and input to the discussion. So I'm just going to move along then. I just wanted to touch briefly on our task force itself. We have a great diverse group of specialists that have come to us and are participating in efforts from the UK, Saudi Arabia, the US, Mexico, Dubai, Canada, Russia. Our two newest members, Valerie Krumak, who's the head of human experience at AIC in Russia, and Lourdes Areolia is an independent consultant with Lincolnium in Mexico. So I just wanted to also just briefly touch on, I'm sorry for the chicken sounds in the back. It wouldn't be a COVID Zoom webinar without some odd noises in the background. But just a brief overview on our task force to date. We have 13 members, including a chair and a co-chair. We've developed a community of practice in our IAAP Connections platform, which is open to all IAAP members, and you're encouraged to go there and carry on the discussion after this call today. We completed a job task analysis survey last year, which has led us to the development of body of knowledge, which is in progress. We'll be sharing excerpts of that as we go along, looking for input from our community of practice as well. We're also collecting resources for this role, and those will be included on our newly launched educational training database, which also includes a speakers bureau. The link is in the slide, and these slides will also be shared afterwards in the community of practice. And then we just completed a strategic leader and accessibility discussion series in January, and the group is now looking to June to get the next one planned and organized. And just to recap as well, our domains that we do have established, domain 1 is all about strategic leadership, specifically for accessibility. Accessibility expertise is domain 2. Partnership excellence is domain 3, and resource engagement is domain 4. I'm not going to go into those specifically today, as we have spent quite a bit of time focusing on them, but in the notes section of this slide presentation, there is a further breakdown, and there's more details in the community of practice, along with recordings of each of the discussions to date. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two speakers for today, who include, I'm just going to go back to the slide so I get it right. David Codwell is part of our task force. He's the head of accessibility and digital inclusion at the Home Office in the UK. And Jay Wyatt, who is the CIAO, the Office of Accessibility for Minnesota IT Services. So with that, I'll turn it over to David, who is going to start us off this morning.
Thanks, Tracy. Hi, everybody. It's about 5 o'clock here in the UK, so it feels really weird to be saying good morning. But good morning and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Today's session, as Tracy's outlined, is quite a broad brush session. We're not focusing on a single domain, but looking sort of broadly across domain areas to discuss how strategic leaders in accessibility should sort of design and implement a strategic plan for accessibility. I'm going to start us off by talking about sort of setting up standards and governance, and then we'll kind of continue through the rest of the agenda. It's really interesting for me, actually, this topic, because at the Home Office, this is exactly the work that we're doing right now. So I'm really interested to hear all of your thoughts about this topic, and to get your insights into where strategic leaders should be focusing in terms of strategic accessibility planning. In terms of kicking off, then, so on this slide, I want to discuss standards and governance. So in general, accessibility policy is probably one of the best first places to start when considering implementing a strategic plan for accessibility at scale. As you'll all know, and as I certainly know, most organizations live by policy. And so ensuring there's an accessibility policy which can be referred to by standards creates a really strong link and really strong anchor for your organization to start to sort of scale around accessibility. Policies are also very often the way to flag non-compliances and issues in order to get traction and to resolve non-compliances and defects, for example. Once you've got a policy, one of the things that we've found is really important, and I've certainly seen being done elsewhere, is tying that accessibility policy back to really important and key organizational strategies and policies that can provide a really strong connection for the accessibility policy. So this could be, for example, a technology strategy that talks about putting users at the center of technology decisions and services, or a D&I policy that talks about the inclusion of disabled people in the workforce. Providing that linkage and that sort of dependency between other policies and the accessibility one really strengthens policy and provides that ability to kind of influence more broadly. Of course, an important part of policy is the standards and guidelines that you want to align to. Jay and I both come from a digital accessibility background, but we know that it's really important that depending on the level of your policy, to ensure that the standards that you refer to are relevant. So whether that's built environment standards, local regulations, legal obligations. For example, in the UK, we've got some regulatory policies around accessibility for public sector organizations. And so providing that kind of connection between policy, guidelines, and standards is really vital here. And then the last thing I wanted to say is it's a turn of phrase that is often used more in things like user research and design, but accessibility really is a team sport. And so as part of sort of setting up for success, I think it's really important to start thinking about who else should be responsible for accessibility across the organization. And having just done this activity, it's really interesting to me how broad you can go and how deep into the organization accessibility really does need to feature in accountabilities and responsibilities. And so it should never just be an accessibility team or specialist that should be left to do all the dirty work. Finding who should be able to do that and be able to support this will really help to scale up accessibility. Jay.
Thank you, David. That was a great start. So I'm going to kind of continue what David was talking about regarding team accessibility be a team sport. But by the way, before I forget, I noticed in the agenda, it said something about a Minnesota State case study. It's actually the state of Minnesota. So I'm not talking from a university perspective. I'm also talking from the government perspective when we talk about things. Anyway, so in multidisciplinary accessibility groups, that kind of seems self-evident, but you'd be surprised how often people don't actually try to draw from all the relevant stakeholders when talking about accessibility. It's very often a problem that we found that people think of accessibility as an IT problem. Oh, it's for the IT folks to solve. It's an IT issue. It's a digital technology issue. It's not our problem. And so we have to make people recognize it's not really a problem. It's something. It's a challenge. It's a situation. It's an issue that everybody needs to be involved with for it to be effective. So with the three-legged stool that David talked about, we're going to focus right now on the roles and responsibilities. So the best thing is when people start pointing fingers, the best way to do it is address it head on by getting all parties invested. including stakeholders when possible. And so also speaking of stakeholders and roles, as David alluded, there could be more than one strategic leader in an organization. Anyone who thinks about accessibility from the strategic perspective of getting the organization shift turn to the accessibility direction can be a strategic leader. So it's not necessarily the person at the top or the bottom or anywhere. It could be anybody. Also, you'll be more successful when you have strategic leaders and the multidisciplinary, I can't say this word very well, strategic leaders and multidisciplinary groups have multiple layers. So we'll look at those layers. So one layer is the governance layer. At the governance level, you want to have an advisory or strategic steering team, depending on your organization structure. This is how you get your leadership buy-in. Then at another level, what you might call the boots on the ground. You may want to have what we call at our organization, digital accessibility coordinator. These folks, or whatever name you want to call them, they are a mechanism to build accountability and a pathway for training and development throughout the agency, throughout the organization. These folks, you should draw from the business, which we call the business, we call the policy people, the stakeholder people, and the IT people, the project manager, anybody you want to draw from all aspects of your organization to create a coordinator. Digital accessibility touches everything. It touches documents, websites, applications, stuff you build, and stuff you buy, which means every single stuff in your organization has an impact on it. So you need to draw a coordinator from all those aspects, not just from one. And then third, we have what we call cross-divisional champions. So maybe you have a coordinator in the finance office, maybe you have a coordinator in your HR, maybe you have a coordinator in your project development group. Then you have champions throughout those groups who may have a specialty. So the coordinators have an accountability role. If you want to think about the RACI model or ACI, the coordinators may be accountable. The champions are involved. They have the skills. They help you scale accessibility throughout the organization. So there's no one right approach. But if you think about having groups at all the different levels of the organization, from advisory to the coordinator to the champion, and then no matter whether you are government or private sector or nonprofit, you're thinking about this. So now I'll hand it back off to David.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, I think it's really important, the fact that having all of those different people coming together to support and how accessibility is scaled. I think actually linking back to kind of what Jay's been talking about and what I started talking about is the next natural step is around creating a plan and using what you know about the organization to be able to plan your next steps forward. So when I've been talking to people about how they create their plans, the first step is very often, well, where are we right now? As an organization, sorry, I don't know if where you are as an organization, but both as the team or the group of multidisciplinary accessibility groups, I think really is the first step in creating a really solid plan. In part because it'll help you identify what you've already got and what you already do well, but also it starts to bring those people together and create that kind of collective shared sense of how the organization moves forward. There's a number of maturity modeling tools that exist to help identify where you already are. These include things like the Accessibility Maturity Model from the Business Disability Forum, which is one of my favorites, although I am biased. I did help bring it together a couple of years ago. And Level Access's Digital Accessibility Maturity Model, which is very similar. It's built on top of the Accessibility Maturity Model, but it removes the sort of HR-related aspects that are built into the AMM. There's also the Smart Business for All benchmarking tool from the IAP, which is currently being piloted with several member organizations. The task force is targeting Q4 of this year for a release, and I know that Dan Frank has done one of the sessions before. Daniel Frank has done one of these sessions before to kind of talk about that model. Now, using these models, you'll be able to identify where you want to be as where you are right now, based on those levels of maturity. It's important to remember that you don't have to move forward with all the areas at the same time, and that you might need to move some things forward much faster than others. But once you have that kind of broad idea of where you want to be, you can then identify the steps that we need to take. And this could be like a combination of small wins, long-term actions, strategic ideas, things that you need to start today to be able to be successful tomorrow. And then the best kind of output from all of that is, well, what are the resources and budget we need to achieve those things, and what's the impact if we don't get those? Thanks, Tracy. So Tracy said that one of the things that I had to explain was what I meant by eating the elephant. I didn't realize that it was such a Britishism, or it may just be me, but eating the elephant's all about trying to understand, well, how do you break down a massive problem? So Desmond Tutu sort of previously has said that there's only one way to eat an elephant, and that's one bite at a time. And so I guess the thing that I'm trying to pull out here is, will you be able to solve all of your areas for improvement in one go? And the answer is probably not. I mean, even the smallest, newest organizations are really going to struggle to tackle everything at once. And so breaking it down is going to be super important. So some of the kind of ways of doing that vary, but for me, from a strategic leadership in accessibility perspective, it's about identifying those easy things which can be achieved in the short term. So what are the things that we can do today? The things that you need to start today, but that are probably going to run for quite a long time. So, what should you start today that will benefit us tomorrow? And then being really pragmatic about, well, what are the things that we can leave for later, but that we still need to keep an eye on, but we know that actually it's more important to do other things. So being really conscious about what you're not going to do, I think, is often as important as what you are going to do. And layered into that should be a sort of a think about risk here, because I think one of the key aspects of accessibility is about not only creating a great experience for all users, but also kind of thinking about the risks that are associated with not being accessible. So being able to identify where you're likely to be running high levels of risk, or where high levels of risk are likely to emerge from. So things like customer websites or relationship management tools that all of your staff have to use in a 30,000 people strong organization. And knowing those areas of risk will really help with that prioritization, and sort of heat mapping those risks will be a really vital part of being able to identify those areas to focus on. As an aside, one of the things that I think is important to consider in here is sort of linking all the way back to what I said at the start around accessibility being a team sport, and what Jay was talking about in terms of what Jay was talking about in terms of those multidisciplinary accessibility groups. And bringing all those people together actually gives you an alternative way to eat the elephant. So rather than one bite at a time, multiple bites from a whole village of people really means that you can sort of move forward at pace. Jay.
Thank you, David. I'm going to follow up for a moment on what David was talking about, and then I'll go into the case study of the state of Minnesota. Thank you very much. David talked about risk management. He also talked about and created a strategic plan, trying to figure out what you can bite off. And I'm going to talk about our strategic plan when I get to our case study. But I want to mention that one key aspect of our plan that I thought was very valuable was that in our plan, we listed and wrote out all the things we felt we had to do in order to ensure accessibility. And then we highlighted as a risk all the elements that we didn't have enough resources for. So in other words, we weren't saying, this is our plan and we're going to do it. This is our plan that we should be able to do. And here's where we have gaps in our resources. So here are our risk elements. If we don't get these resources, it's not going to happen. So that allows us to think about the priorities of eating the elephant. What can we take on? What can we take on? And what do we want to take on? So with that in mind, let me go back up to the case study about how we are starting our own elephant, the state of Minnesota. So at the state of Minnesota, we effectively created what you would call a policy, a statewide policy through a law, through legislation. It said, the law said to the state CIO, thou shalt create a state digital accessibility and usability standard. The legislation also created an interdisciplinary governance structure that included outside stakeholders. So the law said do it, and the law said here's your steering committee. During the project that was stood up by the IT organization, now Minnesota IT Services, to create this standard, they came to realize it wasn't a project, it was a program. So the stakeholder group went back to the legislature and said, now that we have the standard, which we created in September 1, 2010, we need a program to manage it. That first, the Office of Accessibility, which is where I work. Without such action, the standard could have been ignored. I mean, we could have created the standard, put it on the wall, made a plaque, whatever, and said, we have the standard. But who's going to follow it? Who's going to support it? We need a program in order to make that happen. The challenge then became to get agencies to invest in supporting the standard. Outside of the massive, first one person, then two-person office. We have two people for the state for the Office of Accessibility, massive. Keep in mind now, we have about over, like David mentioned, 30,000 employees. At the state of Minnesota, we have anywhere between 70 to 75 agencies, board, commission, and about 35 to 40,000 employees. So to do this, we created a network of digital accessibility coordinators, the group I mentioned earlier. And that was made possible through leadership support to the governor committee. The governor committee said, you need more than just one person or two people. How are you going to do it? So they said, we need to tell our state commissioners, our agency commissioners, empower people to be coordinators. And now there's a distinction here. In the United States, there's a distinction, demarcation between digital accessibility and accommodation, or what you might call the physical environment. Our digital accessibility coordinators are focused on the infrastructure of accessible documents, applications, and systems. ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act coordinators, have federally and state mandated reporting duties that focus on the built environment, as well as accommodation for the digital environment. As accessibility professionals, we work closely with the ADA professionals and their resources, such as the Federal Health and Human Services Program for Community Living. And in some states, the ADA folks are also the accessibility folks. This is not that case here. Our perspective is that many digital accommodations can't work effectively if the digital infrastructure isn't accessible. The compliance part of things. You can have the fanciest wheelchair, for example, and you still can't get in, and there's only stairs and narrow doors. So by the same token, you could have a great assistive technology, and you can't use the technology if the tool, if the website and system are not accessible. So back to the digital accessibility coordinator. We try to have at least two in every agency, one for the agency or business side, as we call them, and one for the IT group. They collaborate from the respective skill set. Often the agency digital accessibility coordinator has knowledge and skills in document accessibility and perhaps PDF remediation. The IT digital accessibility coordinator is more often a webmaster, business analyst, or related position, and addresses accessibility from that lens. So as my task, moving around my desk, they overlap in delivering outreach and awareness programs, involvement in RFPs, such as defining business requirements, and so on. Everything is within the umbrella of the strategic plan. David talked about the maturity model. For us, the driver for doing a maturity model is written into our strategic plan as part of our risk management initiative. And I think I'm taking good time on that. So back to David. Oh, wait, sorry, one more thing. Next slide, please. I'll do a quick segue. Engage. Next slide. So the first segue about when COVID hit, and everyone scattered to their homes. Suddenly, meetings became a lot more difficult for everyone, and much more so for people with disabilities. For the state of Minnesota, it would have been a lot worse if we then already had the Office of Accessibility and Digital Accessibility Coordinator in place. We were able to quickly create and issue guidance on how to plan for, set up, and conduct remote meetings that supported everyone. And we were able to share those via our public newsletter and blog posts. The health department, for example, was suddenly called upon to provide timely, meaningful data and other information. Fortunately, they already have solid, accessible website templates in place. As they secure a new data visualization tool to talk about where COVID was and so forth, they were also able to leverage our award-winning accessible map tool that we had just developed. And when agencies wanted to buy and put in new tools such as chatbots, we were able to test and push the vendor for updates and improvements to those chatbots to ensure accessibility and usability. All that has happened because we have worked hard to programmatically make accessibility a strategic part of our operation. We're far from where we want to be, but in a much better place than we were 10 years ago. Now we'll go back.
Cheers, Jay. I think what's really interesting from what you were saying is about how all of the things that you've worked so hard to do kind of came together at the perfect moment when I suppose disaster struck and we ended up in a global pandemic. I think what's interesting for me is that our organizations are similar in as much as they are public sector organizations, but that actually your planning and your strategic vision has really come to the fore, and we're quite early in that journey. But I know it's not been a quick thing. It's been 10 years worth of work, right?
Yeah, this is Jay. It's been 10 years and we're still chasing as a people. Well, because of COVID and the pandemic, people are trying to get things done faster and quicker. And make it good and not be the enemy of the great. And so we're always saying, hey, wait, hey. But the good news is when we say wait, they turn around and go, oh yeah, can we help you? Rather than never mind. So there's a little different, a little better, more willingness to work with us on that case.
Definitely. I mean, that's a big cultural change, right? Is that was that cultural change part of your strategic plan as well?
Yes, it was strategically a big part of it, and it's still a part of it. But in fact, in our advisory committee meeting, that's what came up to the fore. We kept talking about how do we implement this, how do we implement that, and people basically said we have to change the culture. And then we said, okay, how do we do that? And that's where eating the elephant, the key thing. You can't just say to the commissioner, thou shalt change your culture. I mean, that's not going to happen. So the culture change has been bit by bit, one person at a time, one project manager at a time, and to kind of going from there. We've also done a lot of awareness events. We created these really awesome, and I could show these with anybody who wants really awesome quick cards on how to make accessible documents and things, and they're tangible. You can hold on to them, you can hang them in your cube, and people like that. So small little tangible things. The other thing was, it's again, the elephant discussion. A lot, when we go online to talk about accessibility, there's a lot about websites, a lot about HTML and coding, which is all really cool. But most people don't test code, but they do test documents. And so we went out to that fruit of trying to train people to make accessible documents. And to start there and really grew that up. So we really have a very strong foothold in that. We're not as strong in coding. We're not as strong in website testing. We would like to be stronger, but that's a very small part of the population. And so by getting documents out there and getting in front of people's faces and make it easy for people to do it, that's another whole discussion. We could talk about how we made it easy. That helped change the culture by just putting in, making simple, easy stuff that anybody can do.
Absolutely. It makes me think of, you've almost, we both now talked about the elephant, and I know your daughter was a bit worried about us eating an elephant when we last spoke, but it makes me think that there's almost like the elephant that is all of the things that you have to do in terms of moving an organization forward. So the things that we've both talked about. There's almost like the elephant's shadow as well, which is the culture change that needs to happen to make all of those things land really, really well, and to sustain the strategy once, well, to keep it moving and keep it going, and like you say, to kind of almost implicate everybody in accessibility. So, I mean, in summary, I think you know, we've fairly quickly moved through a set of ideas about how organizations can build a strategic accessibility plan. Jay talked really impactfully about the role of multidisciplinary accessibility groups that bring people from across organizations together to solve this not insignificant challenge of scaling accessibility. I talked about how to identify where you are and about how to use maturity models such as the accessibility maturity model and the digital accessibility maturity model, as well as keeping an eye out for future models such as the one coming from the IAP to help inform planning and to be able to then use that as a way of eating the elephant and identifying those challenges. And then Jay wrapped this all up with his talk about the great work that's happening at Minnesota State, and the 10 years worth of work that they've been doing there. And then finally we had a bit of a discussion about COVID and about the impact and how actually all of the great work that he's been leading at Minnesota State and how all strategic work around accessibility ultimately pays off in moments of crisis, such as we've seen with COVID. So we're going to throw, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say thanks for that great summary, David. And just to clarify again for Jay, we're talking about the state of, or the state of Minnesota, not the University, Minnesota State.
Sorry.
But there was a question early on in our Q&A, which if everyone does have questions or comments, I can either open the mic or you can post them into the Q&A in the Zoom tools. But there was a question early on from Farah, and I know that you've probably got your answer by now, Farah, but I just wanted to know if we should just maybe back up and just clarify this role that we're talking about, the strategic leader in accessibility, because Farah asked if we're focusing on digital accessibility today. And I think that it's important to highlight what the task force is thinking as far as the scope and breadth of this role. David or Jay, did you want to touch on that?
This is Jay. I mentioned earlier, and I'll say it again, that I think a strategic leader it's different than, say, a hierarchical leader. We're not talking hierarchy here. We're talking about anyone who wants to think, or is interested in thinking beyond the lens of a particular task or particular project, but rather about the implications of what they're doing in a strategic, so to speak, way across organizations or across the scope of wherever they're working. And so that strategic leader can be anyone who is managing up, managing out, or managing across the organization. And so, in fact, I think it works better if you have strategic leaders at all levels, whether it's commissioner or leadership level and the manager level and then the operational level, because then you have some alignment between all those groups.
Great, thank you for that, Jay. Mark has also asked a question and made a comment. First, the comment was, wow, 10 years, to your point about how long you've been working on your plan, Jay. Thanks for keeping the effort going. It's a challenge to find the right people who are motivated to unite towards better accessibility and inclusion on a strategic level, too many silos. But then his question was, will who be included in creating a plan? For example, diverse and equal representation from people with disabilities. So I think that was in your slide, David, when you talked about the who, what, when, where. Did you want to elaborate on that one a bit?
This is David. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just before I do, I think Jay makes really good points about kind of the role of strategic leadership, and absolutely, I don't think that an organization has just one strategic leader in accessibility. It has many, and they'll come from different disciplines, then they'll come from different parts of the organization and different levels of the organization. And I think the more that we can get ourselves into that mindset as people who lead accessibility efforts across organizations, that actually the people who work with us are in themselves leaders, the greater the impact they'll have. In terms of the who, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I didn't go into the detail, but I think that there's a huge role for disabled people and those impacted by accessibility in the planning of accessibility efforts. And how that looks will depend on what your organization exists to do. So from my perspective, we work really closely with our internal staff disability networks or employee resource groups, depending on where you are in the world. That kind of calls different things, but the way of bringing those voices together and kind of providing a view from a disabled staff perspective. And we also have a really strong group of user researchers here who work with both staff and the general public who use our services. So I really think it's like as Mark says, I think it is actually really important that the kind of disabled user voice is included there, both as part of that planning, but kind of on an ongoing basis as well, to make sure that we're not losing sight of the ultimate aim here.
Great. And then Kate has asked, can Jay and David talk a bit more about the governance frameworks they work within and how roles and responsibilities developed and how accountability is mandated?
Yeah, this is David. I'll take that first if that's all right, Jay, and then can throw to you for your perspective. So one of the kind of strategic principles that we put in place really early here is that governance and assurance should be integrated, not standalone. And what I mean by that is that when I arrived at the Home Office, one of the first things that I did was to work with digital and technology leaders here to understand how they were governing other bits of their delivery. Now, if I was, if digital is not where you're at and you're working in the built environment or elsewhere, the kind of the principle still applies. It's about going and finding what's already happening and integrating into that rather than creating something off the side. Because if it's off the side, it's going to get forgotten about. And so that's how we've approached it here. Is about identifying those opportunities to integrate into existing governance frameworks. In terms of roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities. It was a fairly similar approach, if I'm really honest with you. One of the first things that I did when I arrived was around was essentially going and meeting with the chief digital officer for the department and explaining to her, about actually where accountability should lie. Who does she feel as the person ultimately accountable for how we deliver services? Where does she feel accountability sits? And then we had a conversation with her and her leadership team about, well, actually, should we formally move that accountability to sit with you? So we did, and we documented it, and it's now informed the roles and responsibilities framework that then goes into the detail of what that looks like in practice. So we're just in the process actually of rolling that out, but it goes down to the granular level of, as a designer on a program delivering a digital service, this is what you're responsible for when it comes to accessibility. Or as a product manager, this is what we expect from you as a product manager and an accountable executive, for example. So we've built it all in and we're working about how we roll it out. But like I say, it all has to integrate, all has to feed into sort of that central approach to how technology or built environment is delivered. Okay.
Listen, Jay, I would love to hear more about that, David, about how that accountability structure works. So maybe you and I can talk more about that offline. On our end, the governance that we have is like I mentioned earlier in the case study, our advisory committee. And at the state of Minnesota, we have a number of agencies, so to speak, state organizations that represents disability population. So the State Services for the Blind, Minnesota Council on Disability, and the Commission for Deaf, Blind, and Hard of Hearing, and so forth. So we have 5 representatives of those organizations on our governing group. Then we have 5 representative seated throughout the IT. So basically agency CIOs and also from the central office on that committee as well. And then we have 5 leaders of different agencies, so what we call the business side, people who are actually responsible for the services that are delivered to the public or to the employees. So we have basically the three components of our stakeholders, all in part of our advisory group. So that's one level of governance. There are strategic groups. They don't worry about day-to-day stuff. They worry about the strategic vision that we talked about. So that's one level of governance. The other level of governance is us, the Office of Accessibility, kind of similar to what David does. And now I mentioned that we have a law, which is wonderful. The law is our state policy, so to speak. And the law is what I would call a positive law. It's thou shalt. There's no negative. There's nothing about you don't do it. And so that's where, like David talked about, we have to build the accountability to it. There's no slap on the wrist. They don't do it. They do. What they have to understand is what is the risk level if they don't do it. Will they get sued? Will there be an uprising? Or will nobody care? Whatever. So you have to figure out how to get people to understand the risk. And that's what we're involved in. Kind of like what David's talking about, helping people understand it's the right thing to do. Here's the business case for it. And then here's a little bit of the negative stuff what happens if you don't, cost and so forth. And then the next level, as we talked about, are the boots on the ground, the coordinator who helps see that throughout the agency. So in a nutshell, what I said earlier, but again, we try to make governance at all different levels and then build accountability at all those levels. Tracking that is not always easy.
Thanks, Jay. This is Tracy. We have another question that is a good kind of segue to what you just talked about, and that is the succession plan. And how do you plan for succession planning or long-term expertise and resources, especially in small organizations that don't have a lot of employees with disabilities or expertise in accessibility? You know, if someone is your champion and it's with 1 or 2 individuals and they leave, then what do you do?
This is Jay. I'll grab that one first, hand it back to David. This is where I make a plug for IAEP, the organization, because what we have done is we use some grant funds that we have, basically a budget of money that we had that's supposed to be granted to agencies. And we use that grant money to pay for training and certification. So I mentioned earlier, we have our digital accessibility coordinator, and I mentioned we have our champion. What we've done is we've opened to any state employee, hey, do you want to learn more about accessibility? Study to take the SPAM on certification in accessibility or in web accessibility specialist, the CPAC or the WAS exam. And we make it so that it's free, but we also, most importantly, make it so that people are part of a group, a study group together, so you're not on your own. People apply for and get permission from the supervisor, support from the supervisor, say, yes, I support that this person can take some time during work to study for this, and that our agency will help pay for the exam. Now, if the person is a coordinator, will pay for the exam. So there's incentive to be a coordinator, to be involved at that level, because you get the exam paid for. And in that way, it's been fantastic. We have people from all parts of the state who have said, hey, that's interesting. I want to study for and take that exam. And that's kind of how we're planning what you might call succession planning, of what I call scaling, of scaling the organization to have more and more people who have the basic competencies and understanding for accessibility beyond just webinars or online lectures. They actually study for and get certified. So now we have more people with more capacity, so that if somebody leaves, there's somebody else.
This is David. Yeah, I think Jay said it better than I was going to say it. I think the point for me is probably that succession planning probably isn't the way to do it. As Jay says, it's about putting knowledge into the hands of everybody in your organization, because actually having those bottlenecks and those kind of silos of accessibility knowledge within sort of an individual or in a central team, it just doesn't scale very well. So I suppose I refer you back to accessibility as a team sport. So everybody in your organization should have at least some knowledge about accessibility, whether that's how to make sure the documents or the presentations they're creating are accessible, through to, well, how do I, if you're a developer, how do I make this code accessible, for example. So yeah, I completely agree with Jay.
Great. And before we go on to Stephen Lewis's question, Kate had a follow-up on the frameworks, and she was wondering, in any of the written materials that we're going to be sharing, is there an org chart showing the roles and responsibilities and accountabilities? Do either of you have that sort of resource that you could share in our community of practice?
This is David. So I don't have it that I can share right now, but when I can share it, I certainly will. We're planning to, as a public sector organization, we try and work in the open. So absolutely, once it's in a state that I can share it, I'll happily sort of post it into the community of practice.
Great. Jay, did you have an outline of how your accessibility team or your committees work together?
This is Jay speaking. I kind of do, but again, it's not really a hierarchical workshop, like I said. Like I said earlier, we have a massive office of two, so there is really no hierarchy to speak of. But I can provide a slide, so to speak, and so I'll talk with you later about how we can best distribute that.
This is Tracy. Great, thank you. And Stephen's question is, how do you identify those external stakeholders in a way that doesn't exclude certain groups or views and ensures that you get a broad enough perspective while you still have a small manageable group?
For me to go first, I'll go first. This is David. That's a really good question, because I think you probably will end up excluding some opinions, purely from the fact that if you want to get everybody's opinion, you're going to spend your life just listening to other people's opinions. I think it probably, for me, comes back to what's the risk of trying to manage, and what do you already know about. So if you've got a very finite amount of relationship management time and kind of getting those external expertise, viewpoints, I'd probably say focusing on those areas that your strategy is a bit not as well developed on, for example. So for example, if you're fairly confident and you've got good perspectives around people with sight impairment, either in your organization or kind of coming through other feedback channels, or you feel you've got your plan well kind of solidified for those groups, then maybe you don't need to engage with them so much, because you've got the channel set up that allows you to get that. Whereas if you're a bit if your plan isn't well developed, or your strategy isn't well developed around things like cognitive impairments, then maybe sort of targeting those groups as well. And also, what I'd say is I don't think we always have to continue to talk to the same people over the whole lifetime of a program. I don't imagine that Jay still talks to the same groups that he did 10 years ago. It will have evolved and developed as the work he's been doing has kind of become more mature over time, and certainly that's the case not from here, because we're still in that kind of embryonic stage, but in my last organization we certainly changed who we talked to over time.
Well, this is Jay. We actually do still talk with some of the same people that we talked in the beginning, just because they're passionate about it and they're involved in it. But he's also right that we try to keep it as open as possible. The way we do it, and I'm not saying it's the way to do it, that's the best way to do it necessarily, but we have basically an open door that people can come to complain or let us know or alert us. So for example, on the nn.gov website, in other words, the main portal to the state of Minnesota website, at the footer of that is a report and accessibility issue about. So any citizen, state employees, or those who have an issue can do that, can send an email to us. So if there are things that we don't know about, or issues that we should be thinking about, that's one way we find out about it. And then the other is, like I said, we have a range of disability organizations in the state. So it's about every disability group, so to speak, or even non-groups, are represented in one way or another throughout the state agency, and they all know me. They all know us. So if something comes up, they'll let us know. But even if they're not part of the actual governance structure, so there are pathways outside of the, what you might call more traditional governance level for people to alert us, we got a problem. So, and I'll tell you, people are not shy. They will tell us when something is wrong. They will tell us when we have forgotten something or left something open. So by being open, by being transparent, by being visible, we find out and then we can share that. And then our governance group is also like there's a general disability organization that represent most disabilities are there as well. So even if they have gaps, again, there's always people coming in. Finally, our coordinator, people who I keep talking to like our boots on the ground, they ask the agencies that they hear from the agencies and they hear from the fellow employees who are also people with disabilities about what's going on. So here we did our strategic plan, for example. We wrote the draft, we worked with the coordinator to beef up the draft before we even brought it up to the advisory group and then back to the coordinators again. So there's always multiple levels of feedback, both unofficial and official.
This is Tracy. Thank you for that, Jay and David. I believe that you have some questions for the group, and we've switched our platform a little bit on these community of practice discussions. We went in and booked them through our webinar platform. So if someone did want to speak, you don't have to type in. You're more than welcome to put your question or your response into the Q&A or the chat. But if you did want to verbally give your feedback, please just let me know and I can unmute your mic. But Jay and David, did you have a couple of questions you were looking for feedback from the group on?
Yeah, do you want me to go with the first one, Jay? Let's do that.
Sure, go ahead, David.
Yeah. So one of the things that we were thinking about as we were writing this presentation was, what do you feel comes first, the maturity model or a strategic plan? And we got into that sort of chicken and egg kind of conversation. Do you use the maturity model to inform a strategic plan, or do you use the maturity model to kind of give you a direction for the next version of the strategic plan? So we'd be really interested in hearing your thoughts about that.
Kate, I've opened your mic if you wanted to give your feedback directly. Oh, actually it's, if you unmute yourself, Kate, then you'll be able to, there you go.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can.
Yep.
Great. So I think every strategic plan needs to be developed in response to some problem that exists that needs to be solved, or some opportunity that exists that needs to be mined. So to my mind, it's always a matter of how do you identify problems? Are you aware of problems in your organization that you're trying to solve, or are you aware of opportunities that you feel the organization would benefit from? And I don't know whether a maturity model answers those two questions in my mind, but I think an organization needs a strategic plan, and it needs to be built around understanding a problem or an opportunity. And I don't know whether the maturity models articulate those.
Yeah, I think you're right. I can't actually off the top of my head remember if they do articulate that. They're much more like action orientated. They're kind of laid out against the set of well, particularly the AMM and the DMM. They're very much structured around, here are the types of activities we'd expect to see in a kind of mature organization. And there's often a need to kind of tailor them a little bit to the kind of organizational context. But yeah, it's an interesting point. What do you think, Jay? You got any thoughts, Jay? Oh, you're on mute. I think you're on mute, Jay.
Yeah, I apologize. for me, when I look at maturity model, I look at two different levels, and maybe I'm mistaken on this. One way to do maturity model is to get a small group of people to do a very high level first run at it. The more classic way to do maturity model is to create a whole big project and get all kinds of people throughout the organization to do it, which is a massive undertaking. And when I propose that, everybody goes, oh, who has the time for that? So I can see how people might try to do the first run, the high level run and maturity model, doing any low-hanging fruit, so to use a very common term, and go with that. And then develop a strategic plan that you can then empower the organization to put the time, energy, and resources to do a more detailed maturity model for benchmarking purposes. That's maybe another way to think about it.
And I can see Jody in the Q&A saying about how she has used maturity models as a sense check for a strategic plan that's already drafted that helps to focus and track progress. Yeah, I think that makes sense and sort of aligns to some stuff that's going on in the chat as well from Mark and Maya.
And there was a couple of points just in this is Tracy, sorry, I keep forgetting to announce my name, but I would vote for a maturity model first to allow you to optimize the approach to your strategic plan. And Mark also noted more often than not, the feedback I get from people with disability leads to identifying the flaws in the plan than when matures as that, which then matures as it is fixed. Great. And I see that some people were looking on how to get into the Connections platform. So when you go to our website, you must be logged in first. You'll then see another navigation tab that comes up that says IAAP Connections, and that will bring you over to the Connections platform. And you can find this strategic leader in accessibility community of practice. There may be a list of several that you are open to join. But that one in particular, they're all in alphabetical order. If you do need any help, please feel free to contact me and I can provide any further direction. And then Christine also had a comment in the chat. Totally agree, Kate. We'd like to start with the job to be done. Core user journeys are the starting point, then understand experience difference around that. At that point, infuse the insights and hold it against the maturity model. Check sense or comprehensiveness check at that point, irrespective, it is iterative. David or Jay, any thoughts on those points? Or did you want to ask another question?
Well, I think the only thing I would say is well, firstly, hi, Christine, nice to hear from you. Again, I've worked with Christine quite a lot over the last couple of years, so it's nice to see her here. I completely agree that it's iterative. You know, there's no point in writing a plan and then kind of making it look pretty and sticking it on the shelf. It needs to be a living document, and everybody sort of needs to buy into the fact that it's going to change and that it's going to, you know, stuff's going to come up that needs to be dealt with before stuff's going to come up that you weren't expecting. And actually, you might find that through the work you're doing with groups and the way that Jay described, that something comes in and just blows it all out of the water because something urgent has to be done. So I completely agree that it's sort of iterative.
Jay, and in addition to be iterative, it's important that in the strategic plan part of it, I think, is to identify that your plan is not necessarily what you're going to accomplish. Your plan has to include how do I put it, information about where you may not have the resources to accomplish what you need to accomplish. You get those resources, yay, you get to do them. You don't get those resources, okay, there's a risk point here. We are at risk here if we don't have the resources. And so you keep adjusting the plan based on resources or solutions that you create. And maturity model can keep kind of change up by saying, look, we are not mature here. We're at low level here, which means we're at high risk, and so forth. So those kind of things can balance out.
This is David. I really like that, Jay. Actually, it's a strategic plan isn't about what you can achieve with the resources you have at the time that you write the strategic plan. It's about how you need to move your organization forward. And if those two things don't tally, then there's a risk. And I think it's really important to be able to flag that as a risk area for the organization. Do you want to take the next question, Jay, that we wanted to ask them? Ask the group?
Sure, to the next question. I'll keep it to a concrete question. Where do you, okay, so you're in charge of an organization, accessibility. Where do you start in focusing for the elephant, so to speak? Do you want to focus on procurement? In the United States, we have federal law called Section 508. That's actually procurement law. That's where they start what you buy. Or do you start in development, going after developers and teaching them how to make good code? Or do you start with documents, like creating an accessible Word or Google Doc, and then PDF and PowerPoint? Where would you start? Procurement, development, documents, or a fourth thing? I'd like to find out what people would think is the best way to get started.
And this is Tracy again. If you did want to answer live, just click the raise hand in the toolbar and I can unmute or open yourself up for a live answer. Or post in the chat. That's another way, and or the Q&A. While people are thinking about that, David, did you want to, is there a third question that we were looking for feedback on?
Yeah, I'm going to repeat Jay's question because it looks like somebody had a bit of a blip. It was, Lainey, it was where do you focus? You know, if you've got to start eating the elephant somewhere, do you focus on procurement, developers, or documents? And we did have a third question, which was, how do you see your organization scaling around accessibility? I think Kate wants to come in.
This is Tracy. If anybody had Kate, your mic is still open, so you could just unmute yourself if you wanted to jump in here. And again, if anyone else wanted to share their own experiences with establishing where they are on their maturity model or setting up their plan, just let us know and we can open your mic. Go ahead, Kate.
Okay, so I'm here in Ontario, and where we have, I would say, a fairly robust set of standards and regulations. But
I think you put yourself back on mute, Kate.
there, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. So as I was saying, I'm here in Ontario where we have a fairly robust set of standards and regulations, but a less than robust implementation strategy. And so after working in this field for 6 years, the conclusion that I've come to that in the absence of a very strong governance framework that is driving accountability, the best place to start is with awareness for staff. Because when you don't have a top-down willingness to enforce accountability, then starting at the level of staff, and Jay, you may think this is funny, but actually teaching people how to create an accessible document is a simple inroad to a conversation. And it gives people something simple that they can do, that they feel empowered about. I find that at the staff level, there's a real willingness and a desire to do the right things, and they're looking for the right things to do. And so once you start with that simple Word document, you don't drown them with going to a PDF or anything more complicated, then they can build on that. One of the challenges that I've found is that because of the way that the accessibility standards are drafted and that they reference the WCAG, there is no right answer to what makes an accessible product. And people, because we're busy, are looking for the one right answer. So part of the awareness is teaching them and requiring them maybe only to do 10 things to make a document accessible, to just start with that. If they're not posting it to a website, then if they just start with that. So, my preference would be for a strong accountability framework, but in the absence of having a magical wand, pushing for awareness with something simple that people can do, I think drives education. And, you know, I think of it as it's making the sponge wet. You can't dump a bunch of water on a sponge that's completely dry and expect it to absorb the information. But if you start making it wet a little bit, drip by drip, drop by drop, requirement by requirement, then when there's a larger requirement that's placed upon them, they're a wet sponge. You know, they'll absorb the information, they'll be more willing because they're not as daunted and overwhelmed by it, because they've actually started nibbling at the elephant's toes.
Thank you for carrying on the analogy, Kate.
You're welcome.
This is Tracy. There's a couple of great comments in the chat as well. It seems that everyone is agreeing that education comes first. So getting everyone to have their aha moment to really become that champion within your organization. Mark is suggesting that it's, you know, the living document of the plan, PDF, Word, and perhaps also adding in there HTML or a web page that people can go to. And then Tim had a comment similar to everyone else, I think, but it's there's not one way to start. It all depends on the organization. And it's important part is to pick a place to start, and just, this is the best way to start, is just to decide where you're going to get your early victories so you can use that to prove to the rest of the organization the value of accessibility. And SLiA, I believe that's how you pronounce your name. I apologize if I didn't say that right, but education and literacy. And Lane had asked to speak live. Lane, if you unmute yourself, you can make your comment.
Great, thank you, Tracy. And actually reading the comments touched on exactly what I was going to say, is that it depends on the organization. I've been consulting with different organizations, and I've found, and I'm out in Boise, Idaho. I'm chair of a grassroots little organization called the Idaho Digital Accessibility Consortium that was started to kind of help protect Idaho state government from a lawsuit a few years ago. And it all started with them training the education to state employees. And then, as Kate pointed out, starting with something small that they could do today and feel empowered and walk away with. And what we started with was actually accessible Outlook signatures and alt text in those signatures as well. And that one was a lot of fun for that group. But I've also worked with a couple of small businesses, and they were like, well, our really important thing to our experience is our website, not our documents. And for them, starting there made a lot more sense.
Absolutely, I think you could see Jay and I nodding vigorously in agreement with the Outlook signatures. That's one of those like really little annoying things that actually, when you get right, means a lot. And like you say, it starts to get people thinking about, oh well, if I'm doing it for my Outlook signature, why am I not doing it for the rest of the email? And why am I not doing it for the document that I'm writing? And why am I not doing it? And then it rolls, and it kind of keeps going. So that sounds like some great work.
This is Jay, and in fact, we had some great stories in Minnesota about how we combined a statewide branding effort to make all of the signatures accessible, because when we started out, every agency had their own brand. And so we had these signatures in beautiful script with nice little color behind the pink email with red script with it. So by having a statewide branding effort, we were able to say, hey, and everybody can have an accessible email or signature. And it was a huge win. Just to start there, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I think how accessibility is incorporated into how we teach people about how we teach people digital skills and sort of digital literacy skills is also really important as well. I think particularly those of us in accessibility often forget about the fact that a lot of people who use who are in work don't actually have great digital literacy and digital skills, and actually incorporating accessibility into how we teach people how to use the tools that they get given by their organizations, just as part of how we teach them, means that it feels like second nature rather than being this extra thing that people have to do. And part of that's templates like Jay talked about, but I think part of it's just making it feel normal and making it feel kind of as part of how we do things around here.
This is Jay. Now, I will say, I will go back to, I'm not sure if I pronounced her name right, Lane or Lane, pointed out that there are small organizations, small companies that say, well, our website is our portal. We need more, we care more about that than documents. I totally get that. And I see that as one of the greatest barriers we have right now for accessibility is, like at the state government level, we can have accessible PDF because we can buy the right tool for that. But a small company or a small nonprofit or people who work, for example, with a Mac, I'm not slamming Apple, but basically you have a Mac, you try to convert to a PDF, it doesn't tend to work well. And I see that as a huge problem. It's not a problem created by us, it's a problem that we need to get our vendor to solve. Because PDF, accessible PDF should not be that hard to make. And an accessible web page for a small organization shouldn't be that hard. Unfortunately, both are also big barriers right now. And so that's a separate conversation, but I really want to make people aware of that. It's one thing for state government to say, we can make accessible PDF, but for everyone else for a small accessible web page, it's a problem. And I see that as an issue to scale to from organizations to small companies, small individuals, and things like that.
Great. And Kate, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I had a comment to what Jay just said about large organizations having the capacity to either hire consultants or buy the software to create the accessible PDF. You know, from my perspective, I work in a very large organization that has the capacity to do that. But a couple of things. As the fiscal situations become tighter, there's less capacity to spend money on hiring either the consultant or purchasing the software. And, you know, we're certainly in that situation now. But the bigger issue to my mind is when we hire outside people to do that work, or we just buy software to do it, what we're missing is the opportunity to raise staff awareness through teaching them how to do it incrementally. And, you know, I used to think that you change culture by raising people's awareness about an issue. I don't think that quite as much anymore. Now I think you change culture by teaching people how to do things differently, and at some level requiring them to do things differently until, as David said, they wake up one day and realize, oh, that's just the way we do things around here. And so those little acts of requiring staff to learn how to create an accessible Outlook signature are actually changing their awareness over the long term. So I think there's a value to that in a small organization, is to, you know, not worry about, oh, we don't have the money to buy things or to fix things, because sometimes having the money just punts the problem down the road to other people.
This is Jay speaking. I totally agree with that. And that's where we found, again, with no right answer, document versus website versus procurement or whatever. But we found that, you know, Sanctuary document was one way to do it, because if you learn how to make an accessible Word document, for example, just all the components to make a document accessible are the same principle for websites, are the same principle when evaluating a vendor. So the structure, the style, I mean, all the things are built into it. And so you're building that awareness. I posted in the chat. Hopefully everybody can see it. If not, maybe I need to change it. A website on accessible document. And
this is Tracy J. You need to select the all panelists and attendees to share it in the group.
David took care of it for me. He's much more savvy than I am.
Oh,
so
perfect.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
So and on that, we have training on how to make a Word document. We also have specific reference guides Now we're on Microsoft Shop, so we use Microsoft, but we use the same principle for Google Docs. And by just making that available to everybody, and then making that available, like making the template available in everybody's computer, which is huge. So I just wanted to put a plug in that. Feel free to use any of the resources here. They're free for everybody.
And this is Tracy. It's a good segue again, just to mention that the presentation and the recording with the transcript will be posted into our community of practice. You'll then be able to access the links that you may have taken note of in the presentation that Jay shared quite a few to get to some of the links that the state of Minnesota is using. And I just noticed that Ken would like to make a point live as well. So Ken, you'll be able to unmute yourself now and make the point you wanted to make.
Okay, thank you. I want to mention something that I think
Ken, you're not coming in very clear. You can just faintly hear you.
Sorry, is that better?
A little bit. Can you just maybe just one more time closer to the mic? I can't hear you, Ken. Just while he sorts that out, so there's another comment in the chat from Karine. Will the new generations of IT staff and other profiles not render digital accessibility as an embedded item in a new organizational strategic paradigm? That would be a great thing. Crystal ball. David or Jay, did you have a response to thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is David. I really like your thoughts. I really hope so. I mean, it's interesting. We talk about this sort of similar discussions going on in the broader diversity and inclusion space. You know, around the next generation being the ones that that don't have a problem with don't have such a hang up on things like trans rights, for example. I'd love to hope so. I part of me isn't that worried that I'm going to be out of a job anytime soon. And certainly I think a career in digital accessibility, or if you've got an interest in it, you certainly, I think you're here for the long haul. But I definitely think things will get better. Partly because I think that the kind of the following generations will be more digitally savvy, and kind of know how to actually make things accessible more easily. Whether they'll come with that preloaded, I don't know. I certainly think there's a role there for it. That if you've worked in accessibility for any amount of time, you know that one of our biggest bugbears is that the education system doesn't set people up to know about accessibility through formal education. I think if we can fix that and crack that, then absolutely it will start to render a lot of this work a lot easier. I don't think it'll render it completely obsolete, but I think it'll definitely improve things massively.
This is
This
Tracy.
is
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go
I
ahead,
have
Jay.
I will add on to that, but first I want to make sure we can hear from Ken. So Ken, can you talk?
Ken gave up on his mic, I think. But Ken, anytime that you want, just jump back in. But one of the things that you touched on, David, was this formal education, and our built environment task force just met yesterday, and that is one thing that the group wants to tackle in that task force as well, is how do we get accessibility and universal design as a year one topic for designers and architects that are just starting their education, and not having it as a postgraduate or a master's topic, but year one, they need to know about universal design and accessibility. So I think this is a topic that IAAP will be pursuing quite aggressively, because to the other points that were raised today as well, education, it's so important, and awareness. I think we had one last question for the group, and then we should look at wrapping up.
Yeah, do you want to do this one, Jay?
This is Jay. Yeah, I just wanted to I wanted to agree that university, we move away from accessibility as a small topic area and move it broadly to universal design, human-centered design, avoiding things like AI bias and those kind of things. And accessibility is a tool. It's not an end goal. I've always said accessibility is a tool to the end goal rather than the goal itself. And so if you start bringing the scope broader, it continues to be a tool, a very valuable tool. There's techniques, there's strategies, and things like that. But the goal is universal usage of everything. So David, we talked about bringing another question.
Yeah, I think we just had one last question, which was
Sure.
the top one on the list. Yeah.
Okay. Well then, yeah, that's a probably pretty good segue to go from universal design and the issue of training to our last question, where how do you scale? We have an office of two for us. I have no idea how many people David has, but in every organization, we always hear about a accessibility person or a few accessibility people. So if you're a company or an organization or a nonprofit, how do you scale? And how do you scale in a sustainable way? We talked about succession planning earlier. But did anybody have any thoughts about the best way to do that or multiple ways to do that? And while we're waiting for people to think about their answer to that, I'm going to do a plug for our newsletter for the state of Minnesota. So I'm posting the newsletter in the chat. And it's a fantastic newsletter. We're publishing today in about 1 hour. So if you sign up real quick, actually half an hour, you have a chance to get this month's newsletter out.
Oh, I'm literally going to do that right now so that I get it. Any thoughts from Jay's question? Feel free to stick your hand up or post something in chat. To answer your question, actually, Jay, you were wondering what kind of a team we've got here. I'm really lucky. We've got a really well kind of resourced team here. And actually, one of the really important things we're now starting to do is to look outside of the team and kind of look about where we need sort of more accessibility professionals across the organization rather than in my team to sort of seed that accessibility knowledge across the organization. I think one of the things that the IAP is doing really well, and we're looking at kind of across UK government, is about how do you professionalize accessibility across the public sector so that it does become a career choice for people as well as being something that everybody needs to know. I think it's really important that we set it out as actually, look, you can have a career and it's really, really rewarding as long as you're used to having the same conversations over and over and over and over again.
Jay, hopefully you're going to have the same conversation over and over and over again. I really hope that we can start moving the needle forward a little bit.
Yeah, I hope so. I think we will. Sorry, Tracy, I was just going to say, whilst you're all kind of thinking about an answer to Jay's question, I was scrolling through all of your comments, and I don't know if they're still on the call, but they're not. But somebody kind of commented about allowing people to have that aha moment, and I was really interested to hear from people about how they almost start how you've created those aha moments for people. How you've not manufactured necessarily, but how you've created the space for those aha moments to happen.
That's a great question.
Yeah, not just a pretty face.
If anyone wanted to share, if they wanted to unmute their mic, just raise your hand and we would love to hear your aha moments.
I think Kate wants to share.
Kate, you go. You're already unmuted, and Karina as well.
Okay. Well, I think that I don't know whether the aha moments are so much for me, but I've watched the aha moments for staff that I my role is in providing education and awareness as an accessibility lead in my 2 ministries. And what I've increasingly started to do is to use presentations that that use visuals much more so than text to convey ideas. And the notion that I'm trying to get across is that people with disabilities are snowflakes, just like the rest of us. They're unique. So we can't think about someone with a disability that's just blind with a cane or physically challenged in a wheelchair, that we need to think about them as, you know, perhaps just being colorblind. And so color contrast matters, or, you know, all the nuances. And so I've started to create visuals where, you know, I visually try and depict a particular disability, and then I create a visual where they see what the impact of us not creating an accessible component of the document has on them. And I've watched people in the meeting going, huh, I never understood the range and the complexity of it. And that's been really interesting. And it's been, and I guess maybe I lied, that is my aha moment too, working in the field. I just realized that now, is that, you know, we all need to be reminded of the uniqueness of the client or the coworker. And so, David, you started to talk about the issue of inclusion and how do we continue and broaden that conversation. And I think what I've started to say is that inclusion, that accessibility is inclusion. That if we think about all of the different things that people need, we will include everyone. And so then you don't need to focus on the specific disability, you just need to focus on how do we include everyone. And so I guess for me, the aha moments have come from watching staff respond to visuals.
This is Tracy. Thank you for that, Kate. And Corinne, did you want to make our final aha moment of the day or of the session?
I will do my best. So I'm Karin de Baats. I work for one of the EU institutions. I'm the Disability Matters person to go to. I work in the Diversity and Inclusion Unit. And for us, basically, our Bible is the UN CRPD, because as EU institutions, we have also subscribed to them, so we have to adhere by this as an employer. And what we've done recently is beginning of this year, is to launch a positive action program for trainees with a disability. And on the 1st of February, we had 5 trainees starting, 2 with a visual impairment, 1 with an auditory impairment, 1 with a motor impairment, and 1 with autism. And so it was my task to explain, through a PowerPoint presentation with the help of each of the trainees, to explain about their disability, like the previous speaker just indeed emphasized. They're all individual, even though we have 2 blind users. They're each individual, and I'm starting to notice that, and that was also our basic idea, is to have these people, these colleagues coming into the 5 different units, and the other colleagues having to interact with them and observing, and not just the units themselves, but also in HR and training and all the other IT services, all the other units coming across these 5 people. That's been developing into a huge aha moment for our organization.
This is Tracy. Thank you for sharing that, Corrine. We are coming right on. Oh, sorry, there goes my little dog.
There's the alarm clock for the end of
The alarm
the
clock to say that we're wrapped up for the day, but I just wanted to remind everyone, please visit our community of practice on IAAP Connections, and we can carry on this discussion. I would love to see more aha moments posted in our chat in that room. Perhaps our other task force members that are on the line today can go in and post their aha moments and get the discussion, keep the discussion going. So just as a reminder, we are doing this call the last Thursday of each month, but please take a note when the updates come from Zoom, because we are gearing the time zone or the time of the call to the time zone of the speakers. So while right now it's in there to get us started at 10 o'clock is our target time, I know that there's a speaker coming up that is in Pakistan who's going to join the task force to really dive into this topic of champions and really, flush out what we mean or what the groups mean by champions of accessibility. So stay tuned for more details. We're just about ready to confirm our next session, and a great thanks to David and to Jay for leading us today. And I look forward to seeing you all in the community of practice and sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. So with that, I think it's everyone have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.